Close your eyes for a moment. Picture yourself standing in the sun-baked plains of southern Iraq, the wind carrying dust that has witnessed 6,000 years of human civilization. Before you rise, the crumbling remains of structures so ancient they predate the pyramids, so mysterious they have spawned theories that reach beyond our planet, beyond our solar system, into the darkest corners of cosmic possibility. These are the ziggurats of ancient Sumer, and they are not just monuments. They are question marks carved in sun-dried brick, asking us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about human origins, about our place in the universe, about the very nature of reality itself. The mainstream narrative tells us one story. Ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was the cradle of civilization. The Sumerians invented writing around 3200 BCE, developed the wheel, created the first cities, and worshipped a pantheon of gods they called the Anunnaki. End of story. Case closed. But what if the case was never truly closed? What if those ancient clay tablets, those wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay 4,000 years ago, contain information so revolutionary, so profoundly disturbing that it threatens to shatter our understanding of human history? Before we descend into the labyrinth of evidence, theory and controversy, ignite that like button and prepare for revelations that will challenge everything you believe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. The name echoes through the corridors of time with an ominous resonance. Anunnaki. In the Sumerian language, it means princely offspring or those of royal blood. But to a growing number of researchers, alternative historians, and seekers of hidden truth, it means something far more specific and far more earth-shattering. Those who from heaven to earth came. Extraterrestrial visitors who descended from the stars, genetically engineered our species, and left behind a legacy so profound that we are still uncovering its implications today. This is not fringe speculation born in the imaginations of science fiction writers. This theory emerged from the meticulous, if controversial work of scholars who dedicated their lives to translating the oldest written documents in human existence. The story begins not in the distant past, but in the modern era, with a man whose name has become synonymous with ancient astronaut theory, Zecharia Sitchin. Born in 1920 in Baku, Azerbaijan, and raised in Mandatory Palestine, Sitchin claimed to be one of the few people on Earth who could read Sumerian cuneiform. He pored through thousands of clay tablets housed in museums across the world, tablets covered in wedge-shaped script that told stories mainstream academics dismissed as mythology. But Sitchin saw something different. He saw history. He saw technical manuals. He saw first-hand accounts of events that actually occurred. In chapter 76, Sitchin published The 12th Planet, a book that would go on to sell millions of copies and spawn an entire movement. His central claim was audacious and precise. Our solar system contains not 9 planets, not even 8 as we now classify them, but 12 celestial bodies of significance. The Sun, the Moon, the 9 known planets, including Pluto, which was still classified as a planet at the time, and one more, a massive world on a vast elliptical orbit that takes 3,600 years to complete, a world the Sumerians called Nibiru. According to Sitchin's translation of the ancient texts, Nibiru was home to an advanced humanoid species, the Anunnaki. Approximately 450,000 years ago, their planet faced a catastrophic crisis. Their atmosphere was eroding, and they desperately needed gold not for jewelry or currency, but to suspend in their stratosphere as reflective particles to save their dying world. They scanned the solar system and found one planet rich in this precious metal, Earth. The Anunnaki mounted an expedition. They established bases in Mesopotamia, in what would become ancient Sumer. They began mining operations, extracting gold from deep beneath the surface. But the work was grueling. For hundreds of thousands of years, rank-and-file Anunnaki toiled in these mines until finally they could take no more. They mutinied. The workers laid down their tools, burned their equipment, and refused to continue. The Anunnaki leadership faced a crisis. Their gold mining operation was grinding to a halt. It was then that Enki, the chief scientist among the Anunnaki, proposed a radical solution. They would create a new species, They would take the primitive hominids already evolving on Earth, beings we now call Homo erectus, and upgrade them. Using advanced genetic engineering, they would splice their own DNA into these creatures, creating a hybrid worker species, intelligent enough to follow complex instructions, strong enough to perform heavy labour, but not so advanced that they would question their purpose or rebel against their creators. This, according to Sitchin, is the true story of human origins. We are not the product of millions of years of random mutation and natural selection. We are the result of deliberate genetic manipulation by an extraterrestrial species. We were designed, we were engineered, we were created to be slaves. The implications of this theory are staggering. Every major religion on Earth speaks of gods who created humanity. The book of Genesis describes God forming man from the dust of the earth and breathing life into him. But what if these weren't metaphors? What if they were distorted memories of actual genetic engineering? What if the Garden of Eden was not a mythical paradise, but a literal facility, a laboratory, where the first genetically modified humans were produced and tested? Sitchin pointed to specific passages in Genesis that seem to support this interpretation. Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 4 describe the sons of God coming down to earth and mating with the daughters of men, producing offspring called the Nephilim, beings of great size and power. Mainstream theologians struggle to explain these verses. Some claim the sons of God were the descendants of Seth, others argue they were fallen angels, but Sitchin offered a concrete explanation. The sons of God were the Anunnaki, and the Nephilim were their hybrid offspring, demigods who walked the earth in the ancient world and became the heroes and kings of old. The academic establishment reacted to Sitchin's work with immediate and overwhelming condemnation. Assyriologists, the scholars who specialise in ancient Mesopotamian languages, tore his translations apart. Michael Heiser, a scholar with a PhD in Hebrew Bible and ancient Semitic languages, created an entire website dedicated to debunking Sitchin's claims, bluntly titled sitchiniswrong.com. Heiser argues that Sitchin consistently mistranslated key terms, took words out of context, and imposed modern technological interpretations onto ancient religious texts. For example, Sitchin translated the Sumerian word Shem as rocket ship or sky chamber. Heiser and other scholars insist it simply means name or reputation. Sitchin claimed the word Anunnaki literally meant those who from heaven to earth came. Mainstream linguists say it means princely offspring, referring to their status as the children of the sky god An, with no implication of extraterrestrial origin. The word Nibiru, which Sitchin identified as the name of the Anunnaki home planet, actually appears to have been a Babylonian term for the planet Jupiter, or possibly a reference to a celestial crossing point, the place where the ecliptic intersects with the celestial equator. The linguistic criticisms are devastating and detailed. Sitchin, his critics claim, was not fluent in Sumerian or Akkadian. He cherry-picked translations that supported his theory while ignoring vast amounts of contradictory evidence. He created a narrative and then forced the ancient text to fit it. But here is where the story becomes more complex, more nuanced, and ultimately more fascinating. Because while Sitchin's specific translations and interpretations may be flawed, the underlying questions he raised refuse to go away. The Anunnaki were real. This is not disputed. They appear in countless Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian texts spanning thousands of years. The question is not whether they existed in the mythology and religion of ancient Mesopotamia. The question is what they represented. The mainstream academic view is straightforward. The Anunnaki were the principal deities of the Mesopotamian pantheon, the descendants of An, the sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess. They were cosmic, judges who decided the fates of humanity. In the earliest Sumerian texts from the post-Akkadian period, around 2200 BCE, the Anunnaki are described as a group of perhaps 50 gods, though the exact number varies depending on the text. They were associated with specific cities, with specific functions. Enki, god of water and wisdom, Enlil, god of wind and air, Ninhursag, the mother goddess, Nana, the moon god, Utu, the sun god, and Inanna, goddess of love and war. These were not extraterrestrials. They were the personification of natural forces, the embodiment of human hopes and fears projected onto the cosmos. But this explanation, satisfying as it may be to academics, leaves certain mysteries unresolved. How did the Sumerians, supposedly emerging from scattered hunter-gatherer clans around 4000 BCE, suddenly develop a civilization so sophisticated it invented writing, created complex mathematics including a sexagesimal base 60 system we still use today for measuring time and angles, built massive architectural structures, and possessed detailed astronomical knowledge that seems far beyond what a newly civilized people should have had? Consider the ziggurats. These are not crude stone piles built by superstitious primitives. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, constructed around 2100 BC by King Ur-Nammu, is a masterpiece of engineering. The structure measured 64 metres in length, 45 metres in width, and rose over 30 metres high. It was built with millions of sun-dried mud bricks for the core, faced with fired bricks sealed with bitumen, and featured an ingenious drainage system with weeper holes to prevent water damage. 3 monumental staircases led to the first terrace, and from there a single staircase rose to subsequent levels, culminating in a temple at the summit dedicated to the moon god Nana. These weren't just temples, they were cosmic mountains, artificial peaks built to connect earth and heaven. The Mesopotamians believed their gods literally descended from the sky to dwell in these structures. The word ziggurat itself comes from the Akkadian zikiratu, meaning to build on a raised area or to rise high. They were launch platforms, they were landing sites. At least that's what some alternative researchers propose. Orthodox archaeologists insist they were simply symbolic mountains, architectural expressions of the Sumerian belief that the gods came from mountainous regions, built by a people now living on the flat plains of Mesopotamia. But the level of sophistication, the astronomical alignments, the sheer scale of these structures raises uncomfortable questions. Then there is the writing itself. Cuneiform, the world's earliest known writing system, appears suddenly in the archaeological record around 3200 BCE. There is no gradual development, no evolutionary progression from simple picture writing to complex script. It emerges fully formed, complete with a system of over 900 signs representing sounds, concepts, and ideas. This has led to what scholars call the Sumerian problem. Where did the Sumerians come from? How did they achieve this level of sophistication so quickly? The archaeological record provides no clear answers. The tablets themselves number in the hundreds of thousands. Approximately 500,000 cuneiform tablets have been recovered from sites across Iraq. Of these, only a small fraction, perhaps 30 to 100,000, have been translated and published. The British Museum alone holds approximately 130,000 tablets. The vast majority sit untranslated in museum archives, their secrets still locked in wedge-shaped script. What knowledge might they contain? What stories might they tell? The translated tablets reveal a civilization of breathtaking complexity. We have administrative records, receipts, contracts, legal codes, medical texts, astronomical observations, mathematical treatises, and literary works including the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known pieces of literature in human history. These tablets document a society with organised government, complex trade networks, sophisticated agriculture, advanced medicine, and detailed knowledge of the night sky. The Babylonians, inheritors of Sumerian knowledge, could predict lunar and solar eclipses, track the movements of the planets with remarkable accuracy, and understood the precession of equinoxes, a 25,920-year cycle that requires centuries of careful observation to detect. This leads us to one of the most compelling and controversial artefacts in the entire Anunnaki debate, a small clay cylinder seal designated VA243, held in the collection of the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. Sitchin claimed this seal, dated to approximately 2500 BC, depicted our entire solar system. The seal shows a seated figure, presumably a king or deity, with a large star symbol above him surrounded by 11 smaller dots. Sitchin interpreted this as the sun surrounded by all the planets, including one additional body between Mars and Jupiter, which he identified as Nibiru. Mainstream scholars dismiss this interpretation entirely. They identify the large symbol as simply a stay, a common motif in ancient Mesopotamian art, and the surrounding dots as other stars or decorative elements. The seal's actual cuneiform inscription identifies it as belonging to a scribe and makes no mention of planets or cosmology whatsoever, but the controversy refuses to die. Because if Sitchin were correct, it would mean the Sumerians possessed knowledge of Uranus and Neptune, planets invisible to the naked eye and not discovered by modern astronomy until the 18th and 19th centuries. Where could they have obtained such knowledge? The answer, according to ancient astronaut theorists, is obvious. The Anunnaki told them. But before we can evaluate this claim, we must examine what the ancient texts actually say about these beings, and this requires us to delve into the mythology itself, to read the stories as the Sumerians recorded them. The most important text is the Atrahasis, an Akkadian epic dating to approximately 1700 BCE, but based on much older Sumerian sources. This text provides the most complete Mesopotamian creation narrative, and it contains a story that is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The epic begins not with humanity, but with a divine labour dispute. In the beginning, the universe was divided among the gods. Anu, the sky god, ruled the heavens. Enlil, the god of air, ruled the earth. Enki, the god of water, ruled the Abzu, the subterranean ocean of fresh water. But the gods were not alone. There were two classes of divine beings, the Anunnaki, the great gods, and the Igigi, the lesser gods who performed all the manual labour. For 40 years, the text says, the Igigi dug the rivers, dredged the canals, and built the infrastructure of the world. The work was back-breaking. Eventually they could take no more. The Igigi rebelled. They burned their tools and surrounded Enlil's temple, demanding relief. Enlil was enraged and wanted to punish the mutineers harshly, but Enki proposed an alternative. They would create a substitute worker, a Lulu, which in Sumerian means mixed one or primitive worker. The mother goddess Ninti, also called Mami or Belet Ili, would fashion this new being from clay, but they needed a divine element to give it intelligence and the ability to understand commands. For this, the gods decreed that one of their own would be sacrificed. The chosen god was named Geshtu-A, described in the text as a god who had intelligence. He was killed, and his blood and essence were mixed with clay from the Abzu. This mixture was then divided into 14 portions, 7 male and 7 female, and implanted into the wombs of 14 birth goddesses who served as surrogate mothers. After the specified gestation period, the first humans were born. The text is explicit about their purpose. The Atrahasis states, "Let him bear the yoke, the task of Enlil. Let man assume the drudgery of the god." Humanity was created to be a slave species, designed specifically to relieve the gods of their burden of labour. We were not made in love. We were not crafted as beloved children. We were engineered as biological machines, worker units to serve our creators. This story, disturbing as it is echoed in Genesis. The Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, the clay from the ground, the divine breath, the Atrahasis' clay from the Abzu mixed with the blood of a god. The parallels are striking, and they raise a profound question. Are these independent creation myths developed by separate cultures, or are they different versions of the same original account, passed down and distorted over millennia? The Sumerian king list adds another layer to this mystery. This ancient document, compiled around 2100 BCE but drawing on earlier sources, lists all the kings who ruled Sumer from the beginning of time. It begins with a startling declaration. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. The kingship did not evolve. It did not emerge. It descended. It was given from above. The list then names 8 kings who ruled before a great flood. Their reigns are impossibly long. The first king, Alulim, ruled for 28,800 years. The second, Alalngar, ruled for 36,000 years. In total, these 8 antediluvian kings ruled for a combined 241,200 years. Mainstream scholars interpret these numbers as purely symbolic, attempts to convey a sense of deep antiquity and divine favour. But what if they are not symbolic? What if they are actual records, kept by a people measuring time differently? Sitchin proposed that these numbers represented not Earth years but Nibiru years, with 1 Nibiru year equal to 3,600 Earth years. By this calculation, the first king ruled for 8 Nibiru years, the second for 10, and so on. The numbers suddenly become much more plausible. Then the flood came. The text states simply, "Then the flood swept over." After this cataclysmic event, a new section begins. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven a second time, the kingship was in Kish. The post-flood kings have much shorter reigns, hundreds of years instead of tens of thousands. As you move forward through the list, the reign lengths continue to decrease until they reach historically plausible numbers. The legendary King Gilgamesh of Uruk is listed with a reign of 126 years, still extraordinary but no longer impossible. This pattern suggests a gradual transition from myth to history, from divine rulers to human kings, or according to the alternative interpretation, from pure-blooded Anunnaki governors to hybrid demigod rulers to fully human monarchs. The king list is not random fantasy. It is a genealogical record tracking the dilution of divine blood over generations. The Great Flood itself is central to the Anunnaki narrative. The story appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts, most notably in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. In this account, Gilgamesh, searching for the secret of immortality, seeks out Utnapishtim, a man who was granted eternal life by the gods. Utnapishtim tells his story. In ancient times, the gods decided to destroy humanity with a great flood. The reason given is both bizarre and telling. Humanity had multiplied and spread across the earth, and their noise disturbed the sleep of Enlil, the chief god. He could no longer rest due to the constant clamour of human activity, so he convinced the other gods to wipe out the entire species. But Enki, the god who had created humanity, could not bear to see his creation destroyed. Bound by an oath not to warn any mortal directly, he devised a trick. He went to the reed hut where a righteous man named Utnapishtim lived, and spoke to the walls of the hut rather than to the man himself. Reed hut, wall, wall, tear down your house and build a boat. The walls heard the warning, and Utnapishtim, listening from inside, understood what he must do. Utnapishtim built a massive cube-shaped vessel, sealed it with bitumen, and loaded it with his family, skilled craftsmen, and the seed of all living things, animals and plants alike. When the flood came, it was so violent that even the gods themselves were terrified. The Akkadian text describes them cowering like dogs at the highest heaven, watching in horror as the world they had made was destroyed. For 6 days and 7 nights, the deluge raged. When it finally ceased, Utnapishtim's boat had come to rest on Mount Nimush. He sent out a dove, which returned. He sent out a swallow, which also returned. Finally he sent out a raven. The raven found food and did not return. The waters had receded. Utnapishtim made a sacrifice, and the gods, who had been without offerings for days and were starving, gathered like flies around the sweet smoke. When Enlil discovered that someone had survived, he was furious, but Enki defended his actions, arguing that total annihilation was an overreaction. Better to use plagues, wild animals, or famines for population control. Enlil relented, and as a concession granted Utnapishtim and his wife immortality, taking them to dwell forever at the mouth of the rivers. This story predates the biblical account of Noah by at least 1,000 years. The parallels are unmistakable. A righteous man, a divine warning, a massive boat, animals brought aboard, a bird sent out to test for dry land, a sacrifice after the waters recede. Either the Hebrew scribes borrowed the story directly from Mesopotamian sources, or both accounts preserve a memory of an actual catastrophic flood that occurred in the deep past. Geologists have found evidence of massive flooding events in Mesopotamia, caused by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers overflowing their banks. But could there be something more? Could there be a global deluge in human prehistory? The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes exactly that. Around 12,800 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, something catastrophic happened. The Earth may have passed through the debris stream of a fragmenting comet, resulting in multiple impacts and airbursts across the northern hemisphere. This would have triggered massive wildfires, caused rapid climate change, melted large portions of ice sheets creating mega-floods, and contributed to the extinction of North American megafauna including mammoths, mastodons, and saber-toothed cats. This event marks the beginning of a period called the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions that lasted for approximately 1,200 years. If such a catastrophe occurred, it would have been witnessed by early human populations. The memory would have been passed down through oral tradition, eventually finding its way into the written myths of later civilizations. The Great Flood is not just a Mesopotamian story. Over 500 cultures worldwide have flood myths. From the Hindu tale of Manu to the Greek story of Deucalion to countless indigenous traditions, humanity seems to share a collective memory of a time when the world was drowned. This is either an extraordinary coincidence or evidence that something truly global occurred. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The question before us is not whether a flood happened, but what the Anunnaki left behind. And to answer that question, we must look not just at ancient texts and archaeological sites, but at the most basic building blocks of our existence. We must look at our DNA. This is where the ancient astronaut theory makes its most audacious and testable claims. If the Anunnaki genetically engineered Homo sapiens by combining their own DNA with that of primitive hominids, there should be genetic evidence. Our genome should contain anomalies, signatures of artificial manipulation. And according to some researchers, it does. The human genome was fully sequenced in 2003 by the Human Genome Project, a monumental scientific achievement that mapped all 3 billion base pairs of DNA that make up a human being. What scientists found was both fascinating and puzzling. Our genome contains approximately 20 to 25,000 genes, far fewer than expected. But more surprisingly, the genome is filled with so-called junk DNA, stretches of genetic material that do not code for proteins and whose function remains largely unknown. Some of this junk DNA appears to be remnants of ancient viral infections, retrotransposons that inserted themselves into our genome millions of years ago. But other sections defy easy explanation. In 2001, the Human Genome Sequencing Consortium published a paper noting that 23 genes in the human genome appeared to have no evolutionary predecessors. These genes were not found in other primates or in the invertebrate species that should have been our ancestors according to standard evolutionary theory. Sitchin seized on this finding, claiming it as proof of extraterrestrial genetic manipulation. These 223 genes, he argued, were the Anunnaki's genetic contribution to humanity, the upgrades they installed to create us as an intelligent workforce. However, subsequent research has thoroughly debunked this claim. The 23 genes in question were the result of horizontal gene transfer, a process where genetic material is exchanged between different species through means other than reproduction, often via bacteria. The genes came from bacterial sources during our evolutionary history, not from extraterrestrials. But while this specific claim has been disproven, the broader question remains. Is there evidence in our genome of rapid, unusual evolutionary changes? The answer, intriguingly, is yes. Human evolution, particularly the development of our large brains and advanced cognitive abilities, happened remarkably quickly by evolutionary standards. The human brain tripled in size over the past 2 million years, a rate of change that some biologists consider extraordinarily rapid. Genes associated with brain development, particularly those controlling brain size and neuronal function, show evidence of positive selection, meaning they were favoured and spread quickly through our population. Genes like ASPM and microcephalin, which regulate brain size, underwent dramatic changes in the human lineage that were not seen in other primates. Some researchers point to these rapid changes as evidence that our evolution was not entirely natural, that some external force accelerated the process. But mainstream evolutionary biologists attribute this to environmental pressures, to the advantages of intelligence in survival and reproduction, and to the feedback loop created by culture and tool use. The development of language, social cooperation, and technology would have created strong selection pressure for increased cognitive ability, driving rapid evolutionary change. The question, as always, is one of the interpretation. The same evidence can support multiple theories. We have rapid brain development in human evolution. Natural selection explains it. Genetic engineering explains it. Both are consistent with the data. How do we choose between them? We look for additional evidence. We examine the archaeological record. We study the ancient texts. We search for patterns and anomalies that might tip the scales. And we find something deeply strange. We find that ancient megalithic structures across the world, separated by thousands of miles and supposedly built by cultures with no contact, share remarkably similar architectural features, astronomical alignments, and in some cases, identical symbolic motifs. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt, the stepped pyramids of Mesoamerica all follow the same basic design. Massive stone or brick structures built in layers, rising to form an artificial mountain. Coincidence? Convergent cultural evolution? Or evidence of a shared source of knowledge? In ancient Mesopotamian art, the gods are frequently depicted carrying what looks like a handbag or small bucket. This same object appears in stone carvings at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a site dating to 9600 BCE, thousands of years before the Sumerians. It appears in Mesoamerican art among the Olmec, Maya and Aztec civilizations. What is this object? Mainstream archaeologists suggest it was a ceremonial bucket for holding holy water or sacred objects, independently invented by different cultures. Alternative researchers point to it as evidence of contact, of a shared technological item passed down from a common source. A standardized piece of equipment carried by the Anunnaki or their representatives across the ancient world. Then there is the matter of astronomical knowledge. The Babylonians knew of 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn. They tracked their movements meticulously and incorporated them into their astrology and mythology. But how did they achieve such detailed knowledge without telescopes? How did they develop complex mathematical models to predict planetary positions and eclipses? The answer, according to mainstream science, is patience. Centuries of careful observation, record-keeping and mathematical innovation. But some researchers wonder if they had help, if they were given a foundation of knowledge to build upon. This brings us to one of the most controversial questions in the entire Anunnaki debate. What did they actually leave behind? If extraterrestrial beings visited Earth in the ancient past, if they genetically engineered humanity and established civilization in Mesopotamia, what is their legacy? What evidence remains? The most obvious answer is the texts themselves. 500,000 clay tablets covered in cuneiform script, telling stories of gods who came from the sky, who created humanity, who walked among us as rulers and teachers. These texts are real. They exist. You can visit them in museums, you can read translations. The question is not whether the texts exist, but how to interpret them. Are they mythology or history? Are they allegories or accounts? Then there are the structures, the ziggurats, the most iconic remnants of Mesopotamian civilization. 25 confirmed ziggurats have been identified through archaeological excavations and historical records. The best preserved is the Great Ziggurat of Ur in southern Iraq. It stands as a testament to ancient engineering skill, its massive brick structure enduring for 4,000 years despite wars, erosion and looting. These structures served as temples, but were they also something more? Their design with broad bases and staged levels, their orientation to cardinal points, their astronomical alignments, all suggest they served multiple functions: religious, administrative and perhaps, as some propose, technological. We also have the cylinder seals, thousands of them. Small carved stone cylinders that when rolled across wet clay left an impression serving as a signature or official seal. Many depict religious and mythological scenes: gods, kings, sacred trees, cosmic battles. These seals provide us with a visual record of Sumerian belief and culture, and among them are images that some interpret as depicting technology. Strange objects that look like machines, figures wearing what appears to be unusual headgear or equipment, hybrid creatures that some see not as mythological monsters, but as genetic experiments. But perhaps the most significant legacy the Anunnaki left behind is not physical. It is conceptual. It is the foundation of civilization itself. The Sumerians gave us writing, the most important invention in human history. They gave us law. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dating to 2100 BCE, is the oldest known law code, predating the Code of Hammurabi by 300 years. They gave us organized religion with professional priesthoods, temple complexes, and systematic theology. They gave us mathematics, including the sexagesimal system, and an understanding of geometry. They gave us astronomy with detailed records of celestial phenomena. They gave us medicine, with diagnostic texts and herbal remedies. They gave us literature, with epic poems exploring profound themes of mortality, friendship, and the search for meaning. All of this emerged in Sumer between 4000 and 2000 BCE, a relatively brief period in human history. The sudden flowering of civilization in Mesopotamia, the rapid development of complex technologies and sophisticated knowledge, is what scholars call the Neolithic Revolution, the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural civilizations. But was it truly a revolution, or was it a renaissance? A rediscovery of knowledge that had been lost? A transfer of information from an external source? The alternative historical narrative proposes that human civilization is much older than we have been taught, that before the cataclysm of the Younger Dryas, before the Great Flood, there existed an advanced civilization, perhaps even a global civilization, that was destroyed by the impact events and subsequent climate change. The survivors of this lost world, scattered and reduced to small bands, preserved what knowledge they could. And when the climate stabilized and humanity began to rebuild, these knowledge keepers became the teachers of the new civilizations. The 7 sages of Sumerian myth, the Apkallu, were described as wise beings who emerged from the sea and taught humanity the arts of civilization. Were these sages the survivors of the lost world? Or were they, as Sitchin proposed, the Anunnaki themselves, taking on the role of teachers and guides? This brings us to the heart of the mystery, to the question that underlies all others. If the Anunnaki were real, if they were extraterrestrial visitors who played a role in human development, where did they go? Why did they leave? And will they return? The ancient texts suggest several possibilities. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a poignant scene near the end. Gilgamesh, having failed to achieve immortality, returns to his city of Uruk. He shows the ferryman Urshanabi the great walls of the city, pointing out their magnificence, their permanence. The message is clear. Physical works, the achievements of civilization, are the only true immortality available to mortals. The gods have departed. Humanity is on its own. By the time we reach the Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, the nature of the gods in Mesopotamian religion has changed. The Anunnaki are no longer described as walking among humans, personally intervening in daily affairs. They have become more distant, more abstract. They are cosmic judges dwelling in the underworld or in the highest heaven. Their direct rule has ended. Power has been transferred to human kings who rule as their representatives on Earth. This pattern, where gods are initially very present and active but gradually withdraw, becoming more remote and symbolic over time, is found in many ancient cultures. Greek mythology follows the same arc. The Olympian gods begin as intensely involved in human affairs, mating with mortals, fighting in human wars, but by the classical period they have become more distant, more philosophical. Is this simply the natural evolution of religion as cultures mature, or does it reflect a historical reality, a time when these beings were actually present followed by a departure? Sitchin's theory provided a timeline. The Anunnaki, having established human civilization and set it on a self-sustaining path, departed Earth around 1600 BCE following a catastrophic nuclear war between rival Anunnaki factions. The evidence he cited for this ancient nuclear conflict includes mysterious vitrified stones, rocks that appear to have been exposed to intense heat, found at various archaeological sites. He pointed to biblical passages describing the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, with fire and brimstone as distorted memories of this war. The sudden collapse of multiple Bronze Age civilizations around 1200 BCE, an event historians call the Late Bronze Age Collapse, Sitchin attributed to the aftermath of this conflict. Mainstream archaeology has very different explanations for these phenomena. Vitrified stones are explained by lightning strikes or intense campfires. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, if historical at all, was likely due to earthquake or volcanic activity in the Dead Sea region. The Bronze Age collapse is attributed to a combination of factors including climate change, drought, invasion by the Sea Peoples, internal revolts, and the disruption of trade networks. No radiation signatures have been found. No evidence of nuclear fallout exists. But the question of departure remains. If we accept even the possibility that the Anunnaki were physical beings who were present in ancient times, whether extraterrestrial or something else entirely, their absence in the modern world demands explanation. The most pragmatic answer is that they never existed as literal beings. They were, are, and always have been mythological constructs, psychological projections of human hopes and fears onto the cosmos, personifications of natural forces and social structures given divine form. But there are other possibilities. Perhaps they did not leave. Perhaps they are still here, hidden, operating from the shadows. Perhaps they retreated underground to vast subterranean bases, or to remote locations like Antarctica. Perhaps they left physically but maintained surveillance from orbit, or from installations on the Moon or Mars. Perhaps they transcended physical form entirely, existing now as energy beings or in other dimensions, still influencing human affairs but no longer directly observable. These scenarios, to be clear, are speculative in the extreme. They are the stuff of conspiracy theories, of fringe belief systems, of science fiction. But they persist because the alternative that we are truly alone, that we developed entirely on our own, is in some ways more difficult to accept. The idea that we were created, that we have cosmic parents, even cruel and exploitative ones, is psychologically appealing. It gives us a place in the universe. It provides a narrative that explains our rapid development, our strange mix of intelligence and violence, our sense that something is missing, that we have been cut off from something important. The modern UFO phenomenon has become intertwined with ancient astronaut theory. Reports of unidentified aerial phenomena, crafts performing manoeuvres that defy known physics, sightings by military personnel, government disclosure of previously classified documents, all of this feeds into the narrative that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, that the visitors are still here. Some researchers connect modern UFO encounters directly to the Anunnaki, proposing that they never truly left, or that they return periodically to check on their creation, their experiment, their property. The implications of this worldview are profound and unsettling. If humanity was created by an extraterrestrial species for the purpose of slave labour, what does that say about our nature? Are we still slaves, still controlled, still fulfilling some cosmic function we do not understand? Are the power structures of our world, governments, corporations, secret societies, actually controlled by the Anunnaki or their human descendants, the bloodlines that maintain their genetic legacy? This is where ancient astronaut theory merges with conspiracy theory, with beliefs in the Illuminati, in reptilian overlords, in a hidden hand guiding human history towards some predetermined end. These ideas are rejected by mainstream scholarship, and for good reason. They require accepting multiple extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence. They rely on interpreting ambiguous ancient texts in very specific ways. They demand we ignore the simpler explanations provided by archaeology, linguistics, evolutionary biology, and history. Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation is usually correct, strongly favours the mainstream narrative. The Sumerians were an indigenous human culture that developed independently. Their gods were mythological. Their texts are religious and literary, not historical and technical. Human evolution proceeded through natural selection. Our DNA shows no evidence of artificial manipulation. Our civilization developed gradually over thousands of years through human ingenuity and cultural transmission. And yet there remain questions, anomalies, mysteries that do not fit neatly into the orthodox framework. The rapid development of human cognition, the sudden appearance of complex civilization in multiple locations around the world at roughly the same time, the shared architectural styles and astronomical knowledge across cultures that supposedly had no contact, the persistent myths of gods from the sky, of a great flood, of a golden age followed by catastrophe, the strange precision with which ancient structures are built and aligned, the recurring motifs and symbols that appear worldwide, the gaps in the archaeological record, the missing links, the civilizations that rose and fell leaving barely a trace. Science operates by proposing hypotheses, testing them, and accepting or rejecting them based on evidence. The ancient astronaut hypothesis has been tested and largely rejected by mainstream science, but science also progresses by questioning assumptions, by examining anomalies, by remaining open to new data. What was considered impossible yesterday becomes possible today. Our understanding of the universe expands constantly. We discover new species, new planets, new physical laws. The search for extraterrestrial life is now a legitimate scientific endeavour. SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, operates radio telescopes scanning the skies for the artificial signals. The discovery of thousands of exoplanets, many in the habitable zones of their stars, has made the existence of life elsewhere in the universe not just possible but probable. The field of astrobiology explores how life might arise and evolve in different environments, and increasingly scientists are asking not just if extraterrestrial life exists, but whether it has visited Earth. The US government has acknowledged that military personnel have encountered aerial phenomena that cannot be explained with current technology. The Pentagon released videos of objects performing maneuvers that seem to defy physics, accelerating instantly, turning at impossible angles, transitioning seamlessly from air to water. Congressional hearings have been held. Legislation has been passed requiring the intelligence community to investigate and report on these incidents. We are in a moment of potential paradigm shift, where the question of extraterrestrial visitation has moved from fringe speculation to serious inquiry. If it is confirmed that non-human intelligence has visited or is visiting Earth, it will force us to re-examine everything, including ancient history. If they are here now, were they here before? And if they were here before, could they be the beings remembered as gods? This is the ultimate question the Anunnaki narrative poses. Not just who created us, but what does it mean to be human? If we are a created species, does that diminish us? Does it rob us of meaning? Or does it provide us with a cosmic context, a larger story to be part of? These are questions without definitive answers. They are questions that touch on philosophy, theology, identity, and purpose. What the Anunnaki truly left behind, if they left anything at all, may not be physical artifacts or genetic markers. It may be questions about our origins, questions about our potential, questions about our place in the cosmos. The ancient texts, whether you interpret them as mythology or history, whether you see them as allegories or accounts, force us to think deeply about who we are and where we came from. They remind us that human beings have always looked to the stars and wondered, that we have always sensed there is more to reality than what we can immediately see and touch, that we are driven by an insatiable curiosity to understand our origins and our destiny. The physical legacy of Sumer is undeniable. The ziggurats, though crumbling, still stand. The tablets, though fragmented, still speak. The cuneiform script, though dead, has been resurrected. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge of the Babylonians influenced Greek science, and through it shaped the development of modern astronomy and mathematics. The legal codes of Mesopotamia influenced later law. The literary traditions, particularly the Epic of Gilgamesh, influenced the Hebrew Bible, and through it shaped Western literature and thought. Sumer was the seed from which much of human civilization grew. But beyond these tangible contributions, the Sumerians left us something more intangible and perhaps more important. They left us the idea that knowledge could be recorded, preserved and transmitted, that ideas could transcend the lifespan of any individual, that human achievement could be immortalized not in stone statues or gold treasures, but in words, in stories, in the accumulated wisdom of a civilization. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia are the first chapters in the grand story humanity has been writing for 6,000 years, a story that continues today in digital bits instead of clay wedges, but serving the same fundamental purpose: to remember, to teach, to pass on what we have learned to those who come after us. Whether the Anunnaki were gods, extraterrestrials, ancient survivors of a lost civilization, or simply the projections of the Sumerian imagination onto the natural world, they represent something deeply human: the desire to understand our origins, the need to believe we are special, that we have purpose, the hope that we are not alone in the universe. These desires, needs and hopes have driven human inquiry for millennia. They drove the Sumerians to record their myths. They drove Sitchin to translate their tablets. They drive modern researchers to investigate UAPs and search for exoplanets. They drive all of us to look up at the night sky and wonder. But before we can fully grasp what the Anunnaki left behind, we must confront one of the most revolutionary archaeological discoveries of the 21st century. A discovery that forces us to reconsider not just the timeline of human civilization, but the very sequence of its development. A discovery that some believe provides evidence of knowledge transmission from a source that predates the Sumerians by 6,000 years. We must journey to a site in southeastern Turkey, to a windswept hill that locals have called sacred for generations, to a place where massive T-shaped pillars rise from the earth, bearing carved images of animals and abstract symbols. We must go to Göbekli Tepe. The name means Potbelly Hill in Turkish, an unassuming designation for what may be the most important archaeological site in the world. Göbekli Tepe was built around 9600 BCE, approximately 11,600 years ago. To put this in perspective, it predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the pyramids of Egypt by 7,000 years. And most significantly for our investigation, it predates the Sumerian civilization by more than 6,000 years. There is more time between Göbekli Tepe and the invention of Sumerian cuneiform writing than there is between the Sumerians and us. The site was first noted in a 1963 archaeological survey, but its true significance was not recognised until 1994 when German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt visited the location. Local farmers had been finding worked stone for generations, assuming the hill was nothing more than an abandoned medieval cemetery. But Schmidt, who had previously worked at another Neolithic site called Nevaluchori, immediately recognised what he was seeing. These were not gravestones. These were megaliths, and they were older than anything that should exist at this stage of human development. Over the next 20 years until his death in 2014, Schmidt dedicated his life to excavating Göbekli Tepe. What he uncovered defied every assumption about prehistoric human capability. The site consists of multiple circular and oval-shaped enclosures, each containing massive T-shaped limestone pillars standing up to 5.5 meters tall and weighing up to 16 tons. These pillars are not crude standing stones. They are precisely carved, shaped and decorated with elaborate three-dimensional reliefs of animals. Foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, vultures, gazelles, wild cattle, and most prominently lions prowl across their surfaces in stunning detail. But it is not just the artistic sophistication that stuns. It is the engineering required to create these structures. The pillars were quarried from the limestone bedrock of the plateau itself. Archaeologists have found the quarries where rectangular trenches were cut into the living rock, the profiles of the pillars pecked out using nothing but stone tools, then the massive blocks levered out and transported up to 300 meters to their final positions. The largest unfinished pillar found in the quarries would have weighed over 50 tons. To move such stones without wheeled vehicles, without metal tools, without pack animals, all of which had not yet been invented, required a level of organisation and manpower that should not have existed among Neolithic hunter-gatherers. And that is the core of the mystery. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not farmers. They had not domesticated plants or animals. They did not make pottery. They were mobile hunter-gatherers living at the end of the last ice age. According to everything archaeologists thought they knew about human social development, complex monumental architecture should be impossible at this stage. The conventional model of civilization states that settled agriculture comes first, creating food surpluses and permanent settlements. These in turn allow for social stratification, specialized labor, organized religion, and eventually monumental building projects. Religion, in this model, is a luxury that emerges after people have solved the fundamental problems of survival. Göbekli Tepe turns this model on its head. Here we have monumental religious architecture built by people who had not yet developed agriculture. The implications are profound, as Stanford archaeologist Ian Hodder, who excavated the later site of Çatalhöyük, states, "This shows sociocultural changes come first, agriculture comes later. You can make a good case this area is the real origin of complex Neolithic societies." The construction of Göbekli Tepe may have been the catalyst that drove the development of agriculture, not the result of it. Think about what this means. These hunter-gatherers, scattered across the landscape in small mobile bands, somehow coordinated to create this site. They quarried and transported massive stones. They carved intricate images. They erected and aligned the pillars with astronomical precision. This required planning, leadership, a shared vision that could motivate hundreds of people to participate in a project that would take generations to complete. It required an ideology, a belief system so powerful that people were willing to contribute their labour, not to immediate survival, but to something abstract, something spiritual, something that served no practical purpose except to honour the sacred. And here is where the mystery deepens. After these elaborate enclosures were constructed, after decades or perhaps centuries of use, they were deliberately buried, not abandoned, not destroyed by enemies, not left to decay. They were carefully filled in with debris, soil and stone, creating the mound we see today. Then on top of or near the buried structures, new enclosures were built. This process repeated multiple times, each generation burying the sacred structures of the previous generation and building anew. Why? What belief system would demand such behaviour? What were they trying to preserve or protect? The animal. Carvings themselves are enigmatic. Unlike later Mesopotamian and Egyptian art, which clearly depicts gods, kings and narrative scenes, the imagery at Göbekli Tepe is symbolic and abstract. The animals are not shown in natural poses or hunting scenes. They are arranged in ways that suggest they had symbolic meaning, representing something beyond themselves. Some researchers propose they are totemic, representing different clans or groups who gathered at the site. Others suggest they are constellations, that Göbekli Tepe served as an astronomical observatory and calendar, tracking the movements of stars and planets across the sky. One particularly intriguing pillar, dubbed the vulture stone, has sparked intense debate. It shows various animals, including a scorpion, a vulture, and geometric symbols that some researchers interpret as depicting a catastrophic comet strike. Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis from the University of Edinburgh proposed in 2017 that the symbols on this pillar represent constellations as they appeared in the sky around 1050 BCE, the approximate date of the Younger Dryas impact event. If correct, this would mean Göbekli Tepe contains the oldest known record of a specific historical event, carved in stone thousands of years before writing was invented. But beyond the carvings and the engineering, there is something else at Göbekli Tepe that connects directly to our investigation of the Anunnaki. Klaus Schmidt, in his analysis of the site, noted a striking parallel with Sumerian mythology. The ancient Sumerians believed that agriculture, animal husbandry, and weaving, the fundamental technologies of civilization, were brought to humanity from the sacred mountain Ekur, which was inhabited by Anunna deities. These were described as very ancient deities without individual names, predating the more well-known Anunnaki gods like Enlil and Enki. Göbekli Tepe sits on a plateau in the Gurmush Mountains, visible for miles across the surrounding plains. To the people who built it, this was a sacred mountain, and within just 1,000 years of its construction, agriculture appeared in this exact region. The site of Navala Chori, only 20 miles from Göbekli Tepe, contains evidence of the world's oldest domesticated wheat, dated to around 10,500 years ago. Within that same millennium, people in the region began corralling sheep, cattle, and pigs. Was Göbekli Tepe the Ekur? Was it the sacred mountain where the knowledge of civilization was first gathered, preserved, and transmitted? The Sumerian myths state that their gods came from the mountains. The Sumerians themselves lived on flat plains, but they obsessively built artificial mountains, the ziggurats, to replicate the sacred sacred peaks from which their gods allegedly descended. Were they trying to recreate Göbekli Tepe? Were they maintaining a tradition that stretched back 6,000 years to this hilltop temple in southeastern Anatolia? This is where mainstream archaeology and alternative theories diverge sharply once again. Orthodox scholars see Göbekli Tepe as evidence of indigenous human development, a crucial missing piece in understanding how and why we transitioned from mobile hunting to settled farming. The site demonstrates that humans developed complex symbolic thought and organised religion earlier than previously believed, and that these developments drove, rather than followed, the agricultural revolution. But others see something more. They see evidence of an advanced pre-flood civilization. They propose that Göbekli Tepe was built by survivors of the Younger Dryas cataclysm, people who possessed knowledge of the astronomy, geometry, and engineering far beyond what nomadic hunter-gatherers should have had. This knowledge, they argue, was systematically taught to the local populations, sparking the Neolithic Revolution not through gradual discovery but through deliberate instruction. The teachers, the culture bearers, were the ones later remembered as the Anunna deities of the sacred mountain. The site was abandoned around 8000 BCE. By the time Sumer arose around 4000 BCE, Göbekli Tepe had been buried for 4,000 years, long forgotten. Yet the patterns established there, the architectural styles, the astronomical alignments, the symbolic imagery, reappear in Sumer. The handbag symbol carried by Mesopotamian gods appears carved on pillars at Göbekli Tepe. The T-shaped pillar design, representing abstract human forms, prefigures the architectural and symbolic language used throughout the ancient Near East. Graham Hancock, the controversial author and researcher, has championed the theory that Göbekli Tepe is evidence of a lost civilization that existed before the Younger Dryas catastrophe. In his view, this civilization, possessing advanced knowledge of astronomy and architecture, was largely destroyed by the comet impacts around 10 to 800 BCE. But a remnant population survived and set about re-establishing civilization, building sites like Göbekli Tepe as both memorials to what was lost and schools for teaching the next generation. These survivor teachers travelled widely, which would explain similar megalithic sites and astronomical knowledge appearing in distant locations at roughly the same time period. This interpretation is rejected by the mainstream archaeologists, who point out that Göbekli Tepe, while impressive, shows clear signs of gradual development. The earliest layers show simpler construction techniques. The tool assemblage is consistent with known Neolithic technology. There are no anachronistic artifacts, no evidence of metals or advanced materials. The builders use stone tools, organic materials, and human muscle power. Impressive, yes. Evidence of an advanced lost civilization? The archaeological record says no, yet questions persist. How did hunter-gatherers, supposedly focused entirely on day-to-day survival, organize the massive labor force required to build these structures? Where did they get the knowledge of astronomy needed to align the structures to celestial patterns? How did they develop the artistic and symbolic sophistication visible in the carvings? And perhaps most mystifying, why did they bury it all? One answer is time. We compress prehistory in our minds, imagining it as a brief twilight period before the dawn of civilization. But remember, Göbekli Tepe was in use for over 1,000 years. That is as long as, from the Norman conquest to today, 1,000 years is sufficient for knowledge to accumulate, for skills to develop, for social complexity to emerge. The builders had time, and they had motivation. Whatever spiritual beliefs drove them to create this site were clearly powerful enough to sustain the effort across dozens of generations. But there is another possibility that deserves consideration. What if both mainstream and alternative theories are partially correct? What if Göbekli Tepe was built by indigenous hunter-gatherers who had been taught by a small group of outsiders, survivors of an earlier catastrophe who possessed advanced knowledge? This would explain the sudden appearance of sophisticated astronomical knowledge and building techniques among people who should not have had them, while still accounting for the clearly Neolithic technology and gradual development visible in the archaeological record. This hybrid theory suggests that the Anunnaki, or whoever they were not aliens from another planet but humans from another time, survivors of a civilization destroyed by the Younger Dryas impacts. They carried with them the scientific and astronomical knowledge of their lost world. They could not rebuild industrial technology with Stone Age tools, but they could preserve and pass on abstract knowledge. Mathematics, astronomy, architecture, agriculture, the fundamental sciences that would allow civilization to re-emerge. They became the teachers of the Neolithic, the sages of the sacred mountain, the ones later remembered as gods. This interpretation, it must be noted, is still highly speculative and not accepted by mainstream scholarship. But it attempts to bridge the gap between the orthodox archaeological explanation and the ancient astronaut theory. It takes seriously both the physical evidence and the persistent myths, without requiring either extraterrestrials or rejecting human capability. Göbekli Tepe is not the only site in this region that challenges our understanding. Nearby at Karahan Tepe, excavations have revealed similar T-shaped pillars and carved stone structures. Karahan Tepe at Chayonu Tepesi, at Nevelu Chori, all across Upper Mesopotamia, archaeologists are finding evidence of a Neolithic revolution more complex and sophisticated than previously imagined. This was not a single site, but a cultural network, multiple groups sharing knowledge and religious practices across a wide area. Some scholars are now calling it the Tash Tepla civilization, the Stone Hills culture, recognizing it as a distinct phase of human development that laid the groundwork for everything that followed. And what followed was Sumer. The Sumerians emerged 6,000 years after Göbekli Tepe was buried, but did they truly start from scratch? Or did they inherit, through intermediary cultures and oral traditions, echoes of the knowledge first gathered on that sacred hilltop? When they spoke of the Anuna deities of Ekua bringing civilization from the mountains, were they preserving a cultural memory of this earlier time? The patterns are suggestive. Both Göbekli Tepe and Sumerian ziggurats were artificial mountains serving as connection points between earth and heaven. Both featured monumental architecture aligned to astronomical phenomena. Both were centers for communal gathering and ritual. Both represented attempts to impose sacred order on the landscape. The specific forms differ, separated by thousands of years of cultural evolution, but the underlying concepts remain remarkably consistent. Consider also the Sumerian flood myths. Every culture in Mesopotamia preserved detailed accounts of a catastrophic deluge that destroyed the world. We have geological evidence that massive flooding events occurred in the region. But the Younger Dryas event, with its sudden climate change, mega floods from melting ice sheets, and catastrophic impacts, would have been a global phenomenon, an actual world-destroying flood. If Göbekli Tepe was built by survivors or descendants of survivors of this event, they would have carried the trauma and the memory. They would have enshrined it in their sacred narratives. And 6,000 years later, when the Sumerians began writing their stories on clay tablets, they were recording traditions that stretched back to that traumatic dawn. This raises yet another possibility. What if the archaeological gap between Göbekli Tepe around 8000 BCE and Sumer around 4000 BCE is not empty? What if there were intermediate civilizations, perhaps not as monumental or as well preserved, that served as conduits for knowledge transmission. The site of Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia, inhabited from 7500 to 5700 BCE, shows clear evidence of an organised urban culture with sophisticated art, trade networks and social complexity. The Ubaid period in Mesopotamia, from 6500 to 3800 BCE, shows gradual development of pottery, irrigation and settlement patterns that directly preceded Sumer. Knowledge could have been passed down through these intermediary stages, preserved in oral tradition, practical techniques, and symbolic systems until it finally crystallized in written form in the Sumerian tablets. The greatest legacy Göbekli Tepe offers may not be answers, but better questions. It forces us to reconsider our assumptions about human capability in the deep past. It demonstrates that our ancestors were capable of complex abstract thought, sophisticated engineering and organised social coordination far earlier than we previously believed. It shows that the drive to create sacred space, to build monuments that connect us to something greater than ourselves, is not a luxury of civilization, but a fundamental human impulse that may have driven civilization into existence. And it reminds us that our knowledge of the past is incomplete. For every site we have excavated, thousands remain buried. For every tablet we have translated, hundreds of thousands sit waiting, in museum storage. The story of human civilization is still being written, and each new discovery has the potential to completely rewrite chapters we thought were closed. Göbekli Tepe has been excavated for less than 30 years, and only about 5% of the site has been uncovered. 95% remains underground. What else is buried beneath that Turkish hillside? What other knowledge is encoded in those T-shaped pillars? What connections might yet be discovered between this Neolithic temple and the later civilizations of Mesopotamia? The site teaches us humility. For a century, archaeologists believed they understood the sequence of human development. Farming led to settlement. Settlement led to surplus. Surplus led to specialization. Specialization led to hierarchy and religion. And finally, monumental architecture emerged. This model was taught in every university, accepted as established fact. Then a German archaeologist stood on a potbelly-shaped hill in Turkey and recognized what he was seeing. Within a decade, the entire model had to be reconsidered. What else have we gotten wrong? What other assumptions are waiting to be overturned by the next discovery? The truth they don't want you to know may be simpler and more profound than any conspiracy. The truth is that we don't have all the answers. We don't know for how human civilization began. We don't know if we are alone in the universe. We don't know what ancient peoples truly believed or what they truly experienced. The gaps in our knowledge are vast. The mysteries outnumber the certainties. But let us return one final time to the question of physical evidence. If the Anunnaki were real beings who genetically engineered humanity, where is the proof? We have examined the clay tablets, the ziggurats, the cylinder seals, the flood myths, the anomalous sites like Göbekli Tepe. But what about us? What about our own bodies? What evidence exists within our genome that might support or refute these theories? The human body is an archive. Every cell contains our complete genetic history, 3 billion base pairs of DNA that record not just who we are, but where we came from. When the Human Genome Project completed its work in 2003, scientists expected to find approximately 100,000 genes. Instead, they found only about 20 to 25,000, roughly the same number as a worm. This was humbling. But what they also found was that the vast majority of our genome, over 98%, does not code for proteins. This so-called junk DNA was initially thought to be evolutionary debris, meaningless sequences accumulated over millions of years. But recent research has shown that much of this junk DNA serves regulatory functions, controlling when and how genes are expressed. Yet mysteries remain. The human brain is perhaps the most extraordinary result of our evolutionary journey. Over the past 2 million years, our brain size has tripled, a rate of expansion that some biologists consider unusually rapid. Genes like ASPM, which regulates brain growth, show signs of recent positive selection, meaning they changed in ways that were strongly favoured by the natural selection within just the last few thousand years. FOXP2, a gene associated with speech and language, also shows evidence of recent evolutionary modification unique to humans. These changes happened fast, too fast according to some researchers, suggesting that something unusual occurred in human evolution. Natural selection provides one explanation. As our ancestors developed increasingly complex social structures, tool use and language, there would have been a powerful selective pressure for increased cognitive ability. Individuals with larger brains and enhanced language capabilities would have had significant advantages in survival and reproduction, passing these traits to their offspring. Over thousands of generations, this could account for the rapid brain expansion we observe. Intelligence selected for itself in a positive feedback loop. But there is another intriguing possibility that haunts the edges of mainstream science. What if there was an additional factor? What if at some point in our evolutionary history, there was an injection of new genetic material, a sudden upgrade that accelerated the process? This is not as wild as it might sound. We know that horizontal gene transfer, the movement of genetic material between species through means other than reproduction, occurs in nature. Viruses constantly insert their DNA into host genomes. Bacteria exchange genetic material freely. While this is rare in complex organisms like mammals, it is not impossible. In 2015, researchers at the University of Cambridge discovered that humans carry DNA from at least 8 ancient retroviruses that infected our ancestors millions of years ago. These viral sequences, comprising about 8% of our genome, have become permanent parts of our genetic code. Some of them even serve important functions, including one that is essential for the development of the placenta, without which human pregnancy would be impossible. We are, quite literally, part virus. If viral DNA can become permanently integrated into our genome and even provide beneficial functions, could the same have occurred through deliberate genetic manipulation? If a technologically advanced species wanted to upgrade a primitive hominid, would the signature of their intervention be visible in our DNA? Or would it, after hundreds of thousands of years, be indistinguishable from natural evolutionary processes? The ancient astronaut theorists point to certain genetic anomalies as possible evidence. The human chromosome 2, for example, appears to be the result of an ancient fusion of 2 separate chromosomes. Our primate relatives have 24 pairs of chromosomes, but humans have only 23. Chromosome 2 shows clear evidence of being formed from the fusion of 2 ancestral chromosomes, complete with remnants of telomeres, the protective caps at chromosome ends visible in its middle. This fusion occurred in our evolutionary past, sometime after we diverged from chimpanzees. It is considered by mainstream science to be a natural mutation that became fixed in our population. But could it have been artificial? Could someone have deliberately fused these chromosomes? The problem with these genetic theories is that they remain at present unfalsifiable. We have no comparison sample of Anunnaki DNA. We cannot definitively identify which parts of our genome, if any, are artificial versus natural. Every anomaly, every unusual feature in our genetic code can be explained by known evolutionary processes: mutation, selection, drift, recombination. These mechanisms are sufficient to account for all observed features of the human genome. Yet the speed of human brain evolution continues to puzzle some researchers. Molecular anthropologist Catherine Pollard has identified regions of the human genome that show accelerated evolution, sequences that changed very little across millions of years of mammalian evolution, but then suddenly accumulated many changes in the human lineage. These human accelerated regions, or HARs, are disproportionately involved in brain development. Why did these particular sequences change so rapidly? Natural selection certainly could have driven it, but the intensity and specificity of the changes remain striking. We must also consider what the absence of evidence means. If genetic engineering occurred 450,000 years ago, as Sitchin proposed, or even more recently in the timeframe suggested by agricultural development 10,000 years ago, the signatures might no longer be detectable. DNA degrades. Chromosomes recombine, mutations accumulate. The original edited sequences would be scrambled beyond recognition after thousands of generations. Trying to identify specific artificial modifications in our genome is like trying to find a single sentence that was edited in a book that has been copied by hand 10,000 times, with minor errors introduced in each copy. But perhaps we are looking for the wrong kind of evidence. Perhaps the legacy of the Anunnaki, if they existed, is not written in our genes but in our memes, a term coined by Richard Dawkins to describe units of cultural information that propagate from mind to mind. Ideas, beliefs, practices, stories, these are also inherited, passed from generation to generation, evolving and adapting but maintaining core patterns. The concept of gods descending from the sky is a meme. The ziggurat as a connection point between heaven and earth is a meme. The flood story is a meme. These patterns have extraordinary persistence, appearing again and again across cultures and millennia. If advanced beings wanted to leave a lasting legacy, encoding information in culture might be more effective than encoding it in genetics. Genes are vulnerable to mutation and selection pressure. But ideas, especially ideas embedded in religious practice and sacred narrative, can persist unchanged for thousands of years. The Catholic Mass, for instance, has maintained essentially the same form for nearly 2,000 years. Jewish religious practice has preserved texts and rituals for over 3,000 years. The Australian Aboriginal peoples maintained oral traditions for potentially tens of thousands of years. If the Anunnaki wanted to preserve knowledge, encoding it in myth, ritual, and sacred tradition might be the most stable medium. This brings us to the esoteric traditions, the mystery schools and secret societies that have allegedly preserved ancient knowledge through the ages. Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, Hermeticism. These organizations claim to maintain wisdom that predates recorded history. Some conspiracy theories propose that these groups possess the true knowledge of the Anunnaki, carefully guarded and passed only to initiates. These symbols they use, the rituals they perform, are said to encode information about human origins, the nature of the gods, and the destiny of our species. Do these organizations actually possess ancient alien knowledge? Almost certainly not. Most of their traditions can be traced to medieval and Renaissance sources, drawing on Greco-Roman philosophy, Jewish Kabbalah, and Christian mysticism. They are human inventions, albeit ancient and sophisticated ones, but they demonstrate a recurring human impulse, the belief that there is hidden knowledge, secret wisdom, accessible only to a select few who have been initiated into the mysteries. This impulse itself may be part of the Anunnaki legacy if we interpret it more broadly. The idea that there is knowledge too powerful or too dangerous for the masses, that an elite must guard and control information, this is a pattern we see in every hierarchical society from ancient Sumer to modern government classification systems. The Anunnaki, whether real or mythological, represent the archetype of the powerful knowledge giver who is also the controller. They gave humanity the gift of civilization, but they also created us as servants. They provided knowledge, but they limited it. This is the paradox at the heart of the myth. Are we grateful children or resentful slaves? The psychological impact of this narrative is profound. It creates a worldview in which hidden powers shape human destiny, in which true knowledge is kept secret, in which we are always controlled by forces we cannot see or challenge. This worldview is enormously influential in the modern conspiracy thinking. The belief that secret organizations rule the world, that governments hide the truth about extraterrestrials, that we are not told the real story of human origins, all of these contemporary conspiracy theories echo the ancient pattern. We are slaves who have forgotten our chains. The gods are still in control, but they hide in the shadows. Only by uncovering the hidden truth can we achieve true freedom. There is something psychologically satisfying about this narrative structure. It explains why the world feels wrong, why we feel powerless, why injustice and suffering persist. It is not our fault. It is not even really the fault of visible human institutions. It is the hidden hand, the Anunnaki or their successors, pulling the strings. This shifts responsibility away from us. It also, paradoxically, empowers those who accept the narrative. They become the awakened ones, those who see through the lies, part of a select group that understands the true nature of reality. But we must be careful. The desire for secret knowledge can lead us away from truth as easily as toward it. When we become convinced that mainstream sources are lying, that established facts are false, that only alternative sources can be trusted, we make ourselves vulnerable to manipulation. The irony is that in seeking to escape control, we may simply be choosing different controllers, accepting different narratives without subjecting them to the same critical scrutiny we apply to orthodox claims. The healthiest approach is epistemic humility. We acknowledge what we know, admit what we don't know, and remain open to new evidence while maintaining critical standards. We can appreciate the Anunnaki narrative for what it offers, a fascinating and thought-provoking way of interpreting ancient myths and archaeological anomalies, without requiring that we accept it as literal truth. We can explore these ideas without believing them, using them as tools to question our assumptions and expand our thinking. What the Anunnaki truly left behind then may be this: a mirror. When we look at these ancient stories of gods who created humanity for their own purposes, who walked among us and then departed, we see reflected our own deepest questions and fears, questions about authority and freedom, about knowledge and power, about our origins and our destiny, about whether we are special or insignificant in the vast cosmos. These stories force us to confront uncomfortable possibilities, that we might not be the pinnacle of creation but the product of someone else's design, that our history might not be what we have been taught, that the universe might be far stranger and more populated than we imagine. But they also offer hope, hope that we are not alone, hope that there is more to reality than material existence, hope that we might one day reconnect with our cosmic family, whoever and wherever they might be. The archaeological record continues to grow. Every year, new discoveries emerge. Ancient sites are excavated. Lost texts are translated. Our understanding deepens. Perhaps someday we will find definitive proof one way or another. A tablet explicitly describing genetic engineering in terms unmistakable even to a modern biologist. An artifact made of materials that could not have been produced by ancient technology. Physical remains of a non-human intelligence. Or perhaps we will finally fill in all the gaps in our knowledge with conventional explanations, the mysteries resolved through patient scientific work. Until that day, the Anunnaki remain what they have always been. A powerful story about humanity's place in the universe. Whether you interpret them as literal extraterrestrials, as metaphors for natural forces, as distorted memories of a lost civilization, or as pure mythology, they have served their function. They have made us think. They have made us question. They have made us look at ancient ruins and clay tablets and ask, what really happened here? What did these people know? What were they trying to tell us? And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all. Not gold mines or genetic manipulation, not technology or forbidden knowledge, but the gift of questions, the invitation to wonder, the permission to imagine that reality might be deeper and stranger than we have been told. The Anunnaki, real or not, remind us that the universe is vast, our knowledge is limited, and our ancestors were far more sophisticated than we often give them credit for. They remind us to look up at the stars and consider possibilities beyond our current understanding. That invitation to wonder, to question, to seek, is a legacy that transcends any particular theory. It is the legacy of the human spirit itself, the quality that drove our ancestors to build Göbekli Tepe and Sumer, to develop writing and astronomy, to create art and literature, to preserve their stories so that we, thousands of years later, might read them and be inspired to continue the journey of discovery. Whether gods or myths, the Anunnaki have given us that gift. And in the end, that may be enough. But we have the privilege and the responsibility to keep searching, to keep questioning, to examine the evidence with both skepticism and openness, to hold our theories loosely, ready to abandon them when better explanations arise, to resist the temptation of easy answers and absolute certainty, to embrace the uncomfortable space of not knowing while still seeking to know. The Anunnaki, real or imagined, extraterrestrial or metaphorical, remind us that human history is deeper, stranger, and more fascinating than any simple narrative can capture. They invite us to look at ancient texts with fresh eyes, to consider possibilities we might have dismissed, to connect dots that mainstream scholarship keeps separate. They challenge us to think bigger, to imagine bolder, to question everything. And perhaps that is their truest legacy. Not gold mines or genetic manipulation, not ziggurats or cylinder seals, but the enduring human impulse to question our origins, to seek our place in the cosmos, to refuse to accept simple answers to the most profound questions we can ask. Who are we? Where did we come from? Why are we here? What is our purpose? The clay tablets of Sumer do not provide final answers to these questions, but they ensure that we continue asking them. And in a universe vast and strange beyond comprehension, in which we find ourselves conscious and curious against all odds, the asking of questions may be the most human thing we do. If you've made it this far through this journey into one of history's most controversial and fascinating mysteries, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and the like. Let me know in the comments what you think. Are the Anunnaki myth or memory, gods or astronauts? And what other ancient mysteries should we explore together? Check out our other videos diving deep into the hidden corners of history, where every answer leads to 3 more questions, and this truth is always stranger than we imagine. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and never stop looking up at the stars.